Well, ladies and gentlemen, dzień dobry and good evening. My name is John Keane. I'm director of the Sydney Democracy Network, which together with Sydney Ideas is this evening the host of this event. I want to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Gadigal people who have lived on these lands for at least 40,000 years. I want to say thank you to Meredith Hall from Sydney Ideas. I would like as well to thank Janice and Giovanni and Max from the Sydney Democracy Network for the various things they have done, and I apologize if I didn't acknowledge those who made tonight possible. Ladies and gentlemen, you know that the program notes say the European Union is in crisis, that crippled by economic problems, political brinkmanship, and institutional rigidity, the European Union now faces an increasingly uncertain future. Given events since 2007-2008, this is arguably a large understatement. Consider the recent European elections. You may know that there was a great media circus about these elections. It was arguably the most European of European elections ever. The media in various countries, particularly in Britain and in France, made much of the earthquakes, the backlashes of the populist right. For example, the Front National gains and UKIP's gains in, respectively, France and the UK. I think it's doubtful. If you look actually at the details of the results, you will find that the clear winners were two blocs, the European People's Party and their so-called Spitzencandidate, Jean-Claude Juncker. It's still the largest group in the Parliament, and the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, and their candidate for the Commission, Martin Schulz. But what's more significant is the low turnout in these elections and what that turnout means. You may know that the European Commission expended considerable funds in trying to reverse the trend, which has been unbroken since 1979, of declining turnout. One technique used was to link to encourage the parties to link their campaigns with the nomination of candidates for the new European Commission presidency. And you will know that lots of money was spent in advertising using the key slogan, "This time it's different." But if you have a look at the results, they're very revealing. In France, a mere 43.5% of the electorate actually participated. In Britain, it fell to 36%. The only large increase that happened was in Lithuania, where there was a huge 24% increase, but it so happened that this coincided deliberately with the national presidential elections. You will know that in countries where there is compulsory voting, the turnout was higher. But in Greece, where compulsory voting is compulsory, as in Australia, only 60% of the electorate turned out. And in Cyprus, where the same rules apply, only 43% turned out. Then let's discuss the case of Austria. For the first time, the electorate, the age of majority was reduced to 16, and this was thought to be a way of increasing the turnout. In fact, the turnout fell by some 0.3%. These are figures not designed to dazzle you, but to raise the critical question about the legitimacy of this European integration project. Most striking, I think, for some observers, for me, is the 18th century quality of these elections. In the last 6 years, every major decision was decided by elites and not by parties and national parliaments. And in this sense, the fact that less than 50% of the population turn out to vote means that the election actually had, despite all of the frou-frou, actually had an 18th century quality to it, where oligarchs appeal to people to support them, but those people are nothing like a majority of the population. The haunting question is, and brings us to tonight, is what if this pattern rather than being restricted to the European Union level, what if this pattern is a harbinger of much wider trends of disintegration in the whole project and within member states of the project? A project that is 65 years old and is not doing well. Tonight we have, and we are very lucky to have him, Jan Zielonka. He is currently visiting fellow here at the Sydney Democracy Network at the University of Sydney. He's Professor of European Politics at Oxford. He is Ralph Dahrendorf Professorial Fellow at St. Antony's College. He has had previous appointments, many of them at prestigious institutions, the University of Warsaw, Leiden, the European University Institute in Florence. He has written many books. He is a publicist, he writes blogs, and he has many interesting things to say about the whole European project. I rank him as one of the greats in this field, and you will see from the table that he has just published in recent weeks a very small book which is available, a very small book called Is the European Union Doomed? I'd like to welcome him. I'd like to welcome as well Professor Peter Morgan, who's Director of the European Studies Programme here at the University of Sydney. He has done work on a well-known and very interesting Albanian writer, Ismail Kadari. His book is The Writer and the Dictatorship, and he's continuing to work in this field. Peter is also working on the origins and development of male homosexual lives in German modernist fiction, and he continues to work on Kadari. And he is also involved in issues, political issues, to do with Albania and Kosovo and the future of European identity. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you please to warmly welcome Jan Zielonka, who is going to speak for half an hour or 40 minutes, and then Peter will briefly reply and raise some other questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jan Zielonka.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Thank you for coming here to debate Europe with me in this great city, European city, Sydney. Thank you, Sydney Ideas. Thank you, Sydney Democracy Network, John Keane, Giovanni Navaria, who guided me here for all these weeks and months. This is a very sexy new kid on the block in the Sydney milieu. I wish we would have a similar one in Oxford. We could borrow something from Sydney in this respect. But let me move to the topic. Well, it is indeed understatement to say that there was a kind of post-electoral hangover in Europe. But for students of politics, it's nothing special. People after election night usually have hangover. Winners had usually too much champagne, and the losers are pretty depressed and probably drank something stronger. But this time it was, of course, something special, because this was supposed to be, John would call it, a festival of democracy. It was a make it or break it game for Europe. They were supposed to regain public trust in these elections, or, as some people feared, sink even further. And you already had the results of those elections. Not just that anti-European parties came as first, for the first time in history, in elections in France and in Britain. But also, openly neo-Nazi parties like Golden Dawn in Greece or Jobbik in Hungary basically consolidated their position. And if you listen to John about participation in these elections, plus the number of those people who participated but voted against parties which are pro-European, one wonders what kind of legitimacy this parliament has. as my friend Mark Leonard called it, a self-hating parliament, because many of those elected basically want to disassemble it. And the question is, what went wrong? And why? And is the EU indeed doomed, as this title of the small essay asks? And the story is very puzzling, because whatever you say, you cannot really fail to acknowledge that this was a great success for many years. It was supposed to be a most thriving postmodernist project, guaranteeing peace, security, and prosperity to millions of people. And this dream somehow became a nightmare, and we don't know how to get out of this. But you can only cure a problem if you know what is the reason for this. And this is what I try to figure out. And some commentators blame handling of Euro crisis for all the problems which we had. And indeed, the handling of this Euro crisis was not particularly efficient, and most troubling, it made Europe look stingy, rigid, and oppressive. Other pundits blame European institutions, which are complex, sluggish, and basically hostage to member states' veto. Yet other people, particularly journalists who like personalities, they blame leadership. And indeed, those presidents of European Commissions or European Councils are usually not the most charismatic figures, let's put it this way. I don't have any PowerPoint presentation here, but some of the pictures are really fun. And in fact, leaders of member states are also behaving there pretty selfishly. Well, they do what the voters expect them to do, to defend the national interest rather than the European one. In my little book, I go a little bit further, and I talk about three other problems: the crisis of cohesion, trust, and what I call imagination. Cohesion, this is organizations with the aim to create an ever closer union. And as it happened, instead of convergence, we have observed in recent years cascading divergence. Spain, 10 years ago, had unemployment more or less like Germany, 10, 11%. Today, Spain, which didn't have sovereign debt crisis like Greece, has unemployment 5 times as that of Germany. And the problem of cohesion is not only divergence in economic fortunes, but also the equal access to decision-making. Well, it's obvious today that decisions are being made by so-called AAA countries, the creditor ones. You know the story from other periods of history, how it ends, when the creditors dictate basically conditions to the debtors. Trust. Look at opinion polls, whatever opinion polls, including those prepared by the European Commission. They all show drastic decline of trust of those polls into the European institutions. The only country where this trust didn't drop over the last 5 years dramatically was, guess where? In Great Britain, because it was already so low. And the reasons John described very well: legitimacy. Because the Union always assumed that, people will support the project because it is efficient. It's so-called output legitimacy. And never took care to let people take part in decision-making. There are basically no ways in which people can participate in decision-making in the Union, so-called input legitimacy. This output legitimacy is good when the weather is nice. But as you know, weather is not always nice. Sometimes the weather is bad, and then you have to ask people to stick with you in bad times. And they are not sticking with the Union, as those elections showed. And look, even in this electoral game, we probably read European press about this candidature of Jean-Claude Juncker for the European Commission President. I mean, forget about the treaty arrangements, which says that it's basically co-decision and European Council chooses this person and not European Parliament, but forget about those. Imagine you love Mr. Juncker, because he comes from a great country, Luxembourg, where, when he, as 10 years Prime Minister of the country, stood against all big European powers and defended, banking secrecy, which elevated this country or maintained this country's per capita level in Europe, the highest one. Let's say you like Mr. Juncker. You want to vote for him. But how? In order to vote for Mr. Juncker in these elections, you will have to be citizen of Luxembourg and his district. And they say, okay, you voted for the party of Mr. Juncker, European Parliament. Well, if you are British, there is no party in Britain which is in this PPE group in European Parliament. If you are Italian, you would have to vote Berlusconi, because to vote for Scelta Civica is the risk you lose the vote. So you will have to risk Berlusconi because he is in this party. In Holland, you will have to vote Christian Democrats. Well, so much about people's opportunity to choose leaders. But the biggest problem, of course, is imagination. The Union somehow is unable to reform itself. I mean, they had a chance with European constitutions. They tried, they had a convention. But of course, leaders immediately put their hands on it. And you know how it ended. Instead of European constitutions, we've got the Lisbon Treaty, which is, like a Byzantine Bible. Then the only reform they got through was during the crisis, a fiscal compact. Well, it is seen as a symbol of imposition and injustice in most of the countries. And even if they would indeed let people elect Mr. Juncker in direct elections as the President of the European Commission, would it do a trick? Would people start loving EU from this day? The problem in the Union is that large reforms are contentious and small reforms are of no use. But the Union became too large to fail, like those banks. And nobody dares to touch it. And, they try to do something. But, I'm a great fan of aspirin, particularly when I have a hangover. And I understand aspirin helps for other things too. But you don't treat people with aspirin when they are terminally ill. The reforms in the European Union today reminds me old Soviet jokes. I don't have time for jokes, but this one maybe I squeeze. There is this train where Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev are in this train. The train stops in the middle of nowhere, and Stalin gets angry and said, let's shoot the conductor. They shot conductor, but the train doesn't go any further. So Khrushchev says, let's rehabilitate conductor. They do it, but the train doesn't move any further. And Brezhnev says, comrades, let's close the curtains and act as the train is moving. But reforms are easier said than done. And this brings me to the topic which I actually researched here in Sydney after finishing this book. And then I figure out that maybe problems are even deeper. And some of those problems you may even feel here on the other side of the world. But in European context, if I look at the real problems we confront and grapple to address, I'm 25 years old. I think 25 years ago, more or less, there were 3 major revolutions in Europe, which I call unbounding revolutions. By unbounding means that borders either change or wither or move. And borders are not just lines on the grounds. They have complex institutions to define relationship between space and power, between territory, authority, and rights. And if they somehow are shaken or even wither, all the system is disintegrating. And the first revolution was, of course, geopolitical. It came with the fall of communism. Soviet Union disintegrated, Yugoslavia disintegrated, we could even say Czechoslovakia disintegrated, Germany was enlarged, European Union was vastly enlarged. And Germany was not just enlarged, it was also reunited. And borders were in flux since, producing new states, autonomous enclaves, semi-protectorates, shared neighborhoods, political ideologies, legal rules, economic systems move across all these fuzzy borders, producing new winners, new losers, destroying or creating balances of power. And part of the story was, of course, violent conflict, policy of recriminations, historical justice. We see it today, every day in Ukraine, but we've seen it in Georgia, we've seen it in Moldova, we've seen it in Serbia. Ukraine is only last episode in the sequence. But at the time this geopolitical map of Europe was unraveling, European leaders were cooking up a geo-economic revolution. They were drafting Maastricht Treaty, which was reinforcing single market and creating current currency. And this basically generated free movement of goods, capital, people, and services. So unraveling of economic borders also, of course, produce winners and losers. Today, the losers are easy to see. Greece, Italy, Spain. The winners too. Germany, Austria, Poland. EU has become a center of economic transactions. There are now officially 30,000 lobbyists in Brussels. Apparently 30 other thousand are unregistered. This is where the action is if you do economics. Nobody would go to Brussels. You would go to Antwerp if you wanted to go to Belgium to buy some diamonds, but to Brussels. Private sector has also expanded at the expense of public sector with this unraveling of borders. Markets and market values moved into spheres usually which were domain of the public sector, especially in Europe. Health, education, public safety, environmental protection, even national security. And the third revolution was again global, but in Europe it produced an almost earthquake. This was the internet revolution. Because as we celebrate 25th anniversary of the web, we are saying farewell to some of the greatest achievements of Europe's democratic system: parliamentary representation, quality journalism, citizens' right to privacy. I mean, today, monitoring of politicians is more serious on the web than in parliaments. Newspapers that used to be center of informed public deliberations are basically in decay. Private data of citizens are being used and misused by internet providers and security agents. And the internet doesn't recognize territorial borders, nor does it respect a border between the public and private. Access to internet is unequal, both in terms of consumption and production. Some information is being spread, and other is being silent. Internet has liberating effect because it gives access to information which usually was restricted. But it also can be a very effective tool of propaganda and repression. So, in my view, all those three revolutions have shaken Europe and created new geographies of power which are not fully comprehended. And let's speculate. Who are the losers? Well, Europe's nation states probably are key losers, and the institutions which they control, which is the EU. States such as Greece and Italy are pretty dysfunctional already. I'm not even talking about Cyprus. In a way, these are failed states, although I know that this is a wrong term in other contexts. But the governments implement decisions imposed by them by Berlin and Brussels. Those governments are unable to collect taxes, to pay pensions, to enforce competition rule, to handle migration, or to offer any decent education any longer. And you can say, of course, on the other hand, you have states like Germany, which become semi-imperial. Yes, but without ability or intentions. This is not where Germany wants to be. In the south, but also in the east of EU, EU was seen as an agent of good governance, because those people were rather run by Europe than by their own crooks. No longer. It is no longer seen as an agent of good governance. For Germany, the EU was also an agent of good governance, but for different reasons. It allowed Germany to rule Europe without the cost of empire, both symbolic and material. But today, the EU doesn't perform these functions for Germany any longer, and Germany found itself in limbo. And who are the winners? I think the winners probably are megacities, transnational NGOs, and multinational firms. The role of firms has been well documented by students of neoliberal policies, which point to what? The erosion of the public sector and the ever-growing role of private firms in acting basically as public agents, with public money, by the way. It is also clear that some transnational NGOs like Greenpeace or Transparency International are more trusted normative agents than some states. If you care about the environment, would you go to your government or would you go to the NGO? If you want to learn something about corruption, you go to your government or you go to NGO? But my favorite winners are mega cities. Paris, Milan, Hamburg, Stockholm, London. These are the engines of economic growth in Europe. They produce most of the growth because they are sites of legal and financial services. This is where the action is, and this is where the money comes from. In some cases, 90% of GDP. In other cases, 70%. And they are increasingly providers of social and cultural goods. For most of people in Europe, issues which they care about, school, hospitals, public safety, are related to the city councils, not to the state. But these mega cities, they don't even have a role in the EU policies. EU is run by states, however small and dysfunctional. This is not sustainable in my view. But we not only have winners and losers. I think power is also being executed in a different way today because of these unbounding revolutions. Putin fears more today capital and financial markets than policies of US on EU. He clearly is more scared by independent bloggers than by resolutions of European Parliament. I don't believe that unbounding will eliminate territorial conquests, because they are very often based on symbolic politics. But I think territorial acquisitions that require severe restrictions in trade and communications will not be any longer sustainable in Europe. And what about democracy? And here I will end. Well, unbundling will generate even more mediatizations of politics. The key political discourse already takes place more in the media than in parliaments. And this discourse reflects basically basic media features like spin, spectacle, entertainment. Parties are likely to be losers, in my view, in this, world of mediatization. The winners would be those informal network of politicians, lobbyists, celebrities, media owners, journalists. John called them mediocracy. Well, but this means that it would be informal networks rather than formal institutional bargaining that will be dominant in defining public interests and allocations of resources. This is going to be the way where money and functions are going to be allocated. Well, it's clear that EU is rather ill-adjusted to this new world. And therefore I argue that for the EU to survive, it would have to reinvent itself from the scratch, because reforms will not do. The policy which those governments today have, I call low-cost airlines, They all want the union to continue, but they are not going to invest in it, either political career or money. It is like we all want to fly comfortable to another part of the world and paying very little. Maybe Ireland will become, with the Ryanair, a model of the failed attempt to reform the European Union. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Zielonka. Peter Morgan.
Thank you. What does one say after that? Quite a demolishing of the poor old European Union. I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, shamelessly, but also just to let you know I'm not a political scientist. I come from a quite different sphere. Namely, I teach in a school of languages and cultures, and for the last 25 years I've taught Europe as something much deeper, wider and more complex than the European Union. But firstly, thanks for a very refreshing and original view of Europe, one that comes from the European centre, as you say at the beginning of your book, and one which is clearly neither that of the true believer nor of a Eurosceptic. It's a quite original position. I think that's a very important thing to acknowledge at the beginning. Too often we hear from the representatives of the European Union, one of the problems I think is the refusal to brook any form of criticism and just the recitation of the mantra of Europe must go ahead, there must be closer, ever closer union, and the refusal to actually stop and think. And Professor Zielonka's book is very much aimed at that. One thing I would note, it seemed to me just on listening to your speech just now as opposed to reading the book, is that you're actually more critical, even more critical, of a Europe which is out of touch with, in fact, what are movements of globalisation. It's an old, as you say, a postmodern model based on a model of a single modernity, which is now actually a bit passé. The world's moved beyond that. Globalisation has taken us into the sphere of multiple modernities with different visions of the future, equally valid, if you like, for the moment, whether they be in China or the US or Europe or Russia or India or Brazil. We've got a very changed situation compared to the situation when the EU was first mooted as a result of the European Civil War, if you like, by Schuman in 1951. So you're much more critical, I think, and much less, and I don't want to talk for too long because I know you've all got lots of questions, so John, if you just wink at me or something if I rabbit on too long. Much more critical and much less willing to countenance the possibility of that fuzzy area that you call in the book neo-medievalism, an area that I had a lot of problems with in the book, I've got to say, not only the terminology of it and the language that you use to use it, but also the extent to which what you call neo-medievalism, i.e. these complex networks of interest groups throughout Europe, how that could be actually politically realised in any practical way. Okay, just to go quickly to one or two more concrete points. You speak about crises in the book and you really do show an image of a doom-laden Europe in your speech tonight. Of course, the language of crisis to a certain extent does create its own eventualities. If we speak of crisis, then we think of apocalyptic endings. You talk about a whole cascade or of escalating crises, but I wonder really whether that's the case, whether really the central crisis is not the fiscal crisis, and I'm not underplaying that, but whether it's really not a fairly single thing, and all those other crises start to look much more serious if they all appear to lead up to that. So I'm talking about the continuum in which we actually see this crisis. And I suppose I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but I would just wonder whether we need to talk in the language of crisis. Some of my work has been on the crisis of the Weimar Republic, and contemporary historiography has very much started to look at this term crisis, where, you know, the Weimar Republic, the crisis is seen as leading directly to Nazism. But when you look at the realities of the situation, it's much more nuanced, much more defined, and the language of crisis can sometimes hide aspects of difference, aspects of just the normal operations of pragmatic politics, of negotiation, compromise, etc. So that was the first point. The second point that I'd raise, and I touched on this before, is you're extremely critical of the EU being out of touch, having lost touch with all the new movements, social, economic, political movements of the world, not just of Europe. You talk about new networks of these immensely powerful cities, of various different powerful groups, of groups that have power of knowledge or power of economic power, those sorts of things. But I wonder whether, in fact, at the end of your book, if not in your talk tonight, it doesn't ask the question, beg the question, well, with all this immensely complex set of interrelated interest groups, points of power, nodules of power throughout Europe, whether in fact they can have arisen, obviously, in the first place without the origins of the European Union, if we see the early years of the European Union as a positive thing, and that's something else I would ask you, but also whether at a certain point, in order to be politically realisable, they don't also need a central point, a head, if not an authoritative and controlling body, certainly a central point that can provide some form of mediation, of equalising, of speaking out for those groups or individuals even who aren't part of these very powerful mega nodules which have taken over Europe. So that's just that point very quickly. And then a third point, and I'll cut this very short, and this is looking at the history of the EU, and I think you gave us more background on this tonight than perhaps in the book. And that is, if we step back a bit and look at the history of the development of the EU, we might not be a little more generous in our assessments. And perhaps we can view the crises of the past decade in a slightly different continuum. And I suppose my question to you would be, on the basis of the book, but also tonight, where did it start going wrong? Tonight you implied strongly that it started going wrong with Maastricht, with the European Union moving into a lot of areas in 1992 in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, of the Eastern European dictatorships, and also very much with a reunified and potentially extremely powerful Germany in mind, that the European Union moved from what had been essentially economic models, going from the original steel and coal framework of 1956 through to the customs union in 1968, but then, which then sort of was fairly quiet for years, but then in 1992 you have this quantum leap forward into all sorts of other areas which, as you say, and you say extremely convincingly, the European Union wasn't equipped to handle. Okay, look, I'll basically leave it largely there in terms of the three critical points. My basic question is whether the EU in your reading is flawed from the beginning as a supranational development, flawed by it being predicated on the concept of nation states, what you call in the book the sort of Westphalian system, or whether there was a point at which it went wrong. And then the corollary of that question is, how do we go about, or how does Europe go about solving those problems? If we don't want it to simply fall into this state of desuetude that you seem to be implying pretty strongly it's going to go into. So where do we find the set of point de repère to reorient Europe, if we can at all? Is it in those nodules of powerful cities and things, or is it elsewhere? Do we need a more coherent and all-embracing model, which then maybe starts nudging back towards the European Union? As I intimated at the beginning, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit. Your book is original, critical, and refreshingly pragmatic, and best of all, free of the high moral tone that tends to accompany and also typically to obfuscate so much discussion of the EU in Europe, if not in Australia. In Australia, I suspect the opposite is the case, that the understanding and complexity of the issues is often not greatly understood. If we look at what Julia Gillard said a couple of years ago in Europe, I for one cringed because it was extremely arrogant. Okay, so thanks for your book. It's a very welcome addition to the debate on Europe, and I'm sure as hell going to set it on my new unit on Europe in Theory next year. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Jan, would you like to reply to some of these points, or we go straight to questions?
Thank you, Jan. Profoundly insightful, said with humour, bravo. I note that UKIP didn't do terribly well in the mega city of London, which I think probably only backs up your point. But my question is a very direct one. You talked about a failure of imagination. I wonder if you could just also share with us your thoughts on a failure of collective memory. Ask the person on the Clapham omnibus, what is the point? What is the point of the European Union? Have people forgotten?
Let's go with the crisis. Of course, in the media saturated world, everything is about crisis. Otherwise, it wouldn't be on the news, you know. But if this is not a crisis, what is the crisis? You know? Let's put it this way: how things have to get worse, you know, to deserve the name of the crisis. And I didn't say apocalyptic, but I believe in a process here. I try to take a long perspective. But I know one thing. EU people always say, EU officials always say, Europe always come out stronger from each crisis. And we will come stronger this time too. I say, good luck. Because I don't believe in a kind of historical materialism that we are kind of doomed to success. Like, I'm not convinced that we are doomed to failure. I come from European positions. There is no doubt about this. You cannot be more European than I am. But I believe that this model of integration today is actually hampering European project. It's become liability. And I think something has to be changed. And I even, as you rightly said, I tried to suggest the way in which it could be changed, but I have no illusions that it will not happen. Because there is a certain way in which the Union put itself in a position that it cannot change itself. They had the chance with the European Constitution. There was a very good example. There was a beautiful weather outside, not like now, and they blew it. And since then, they only made changes for the worse, not for the better. Now, of course, those people, those leaders, are not stupid and they are not suicidal. But I actually came to the conclusion that the Union, however regrettably, is doomed, not after my numerous trips to Greece during the crisis. I don't know how many times I've been to Greece, or Portugal, or Spain. But after my trips to Germany, because each time I spoke to German politicians, they all told me, yes, of course we're European. You are for Europe, this is part of our identity, there is, there's no doubt about that. And in fact, if you look, at elections in Germany, although there is anti-European party for the first time getting into European Parliament from Germany too, but this is a minor kind of percentage. But then I asked my German colleagues, okay, I understand you are pro-European. So what? Will you support the stronger role of the European Commission as a guardian of communal interest? No. European Commission, it's bureaucratic, it's rigid, they don't allow us to do anything. This Barroso, we don't even talk to this guy. So I said, I'm sorry. Yeah. Parliament, European Parliament. No, Bundestag would never allow this. The Constitutional Court would immediately strike this. No, the Parliament got all those powers, but it's not legitimate really. They are only messing around. So you go further and you say, okay, so what you will do? Will you in the Council, yeah? Will you do the Council? With the heads of state. No, 28 of states, are you crazy? We cannot do anything with 28 states. They all constantly quarrel. We are sick of this. You take the Poles, the French are angry. You take the French, the Poles are angry. The Spanish cannot go along with Portuguese. Oh, you cannot do this. We are pragmatic people. I said, what does it mean? Well, we deal with those who want to contribute are able to contribute. So, these issues we solve with those countries, and the other issues with those countries. We are pragmatic people. Well, but this is not how the treaty defines European cooperation. This is how Donald Rumsfeld ran his policies. You remember? Mission defines coalition. This is not what the European integrations was about. European integrations, and here I come to Nick's question, was about many different things, and the objective changed over the years. But certainly, it was about the end of power politics in Europe. This continent, which was divided, at war with each other for centuries. They were supposed to put the end of power politics by delegating or seizing sovereignty. And large countries were no longer to bully small countries. And above all, they were not going to be run by Germany again. And where we are today? For others, European integration was not just about prosperity, because we all want to be prosperous, By the way, in Australia, you are very prosperous, and government talks about crisis. I have a feeling you are living with debtocracy, not democracy. But economically speaking, European integrations was supposed to let Stockholm consensus to prevail over Washington consensus. Europeans pride themselves that they actually have social policy, that they are trying to bridge the gap between poor and rich across countries and within countries, that they have actual public education schools financed by public bodies. And today, the Union is basically the agent of Washington consensus. The European Commission asked all those countries who happen to be indebted, largely because there were weak chains in the system, I don't want to exonerate Greeks from all the things they have done. They admitted themselves they cheated, statistics, yeah? And I'm not surprised the weak always cheat. What the weak are supposed to do? They cheat. But the Greeks didn't invent the EMU setup and Maastricht criteria. And it was Germany and France which broke macroeconomic criteria first. But now the EU, the European Commission, all Ukraine is going to those countries and say, no, privatize this, cut on pensions, kind of thing. Why? Because those countries, basically, on suggestions of Germany and all creditor countries, they basically bail out their banks. But Germany could afford this and Greece couldn't. If only because most of those banks were German anyway. Or Austrians, or Dutch, because let's not put our fingers only on the Germans. It's easy on the Germans because they are the biggest, the elephant in the room, right? But much more, the Germans actually are trying to convince other creditor countries, like Finland in particular, Holland, Austria, to be much more gentle towards certain countries. So it's not just Germany. The only problem with Germany is, I always say, Germany is the German love for the others is, they don't realize that their relationship with the others is like a relationship of elephant with the mouses. The elephant loves the mouses, but each time when in sleep they turn on the other side, the mouses run for life. Germans don't want to be in this situation, but they are. They don't want to be empire, and they don't know how to run empire, because the British will tell you that empire costs a hell of money and hassle. And you always have to do something for the peripheries. You cannot run empires only with your interest in mind. Okay, so this is the story. The story here, Nick, is that first of all, they always kept the aim of integration vague, so there is something for everybody. And it went well for many years. And the objective has changed, for instance, and it also depends what you look at. My friend from Harvard, Andrew Moravchik, he looked at the negotiations leading to the Treaty of Rome, and he found out that they only talk about agriculture. So he said, European integration is about agriculture. And you look where the money is, by the way. Most of the budget is on agriculture. So this is not about peace and security. But everybody in Europe understands that this is not the only thing. Economically speaking, the EU was supposed to fence Europe off globalization. But in a way, it became an agent of globalizations within, for good or for bad. We can argue on this. I can tell you on which side I am. But that's not the point. The point is empirically to establish where they are. I think I spoke too long already, and I see already Sef.
Thank you very much. My name is Sevozdowski, and I would like to ask you to focus a bit on Europe as a society. Australia is also a very diverse society, in different way, but very diverse. If you look at Sydney, Melbourne, over 60% of people living here have been born in different countries or are children of people born in different countries. We are taking over 1% of new migrants coming in every year since Second World War. So we are very diverse, but we are very proud also on our achievements in the integration area, and we claim that our multicultural policy is very good and delivers peace and integration and social justice as well. Going to Europe, what's keep Europe together as a society? What ideas are these gluing factors which could stop this disintegration you are talking about? And the second question is, what impact on European stability does have immigration from third world countries? Thank you.
Look, in a way, European integration was about handling diversity. You can say that this was one of the main objectives, to make sure that those countries are so diverse, and this diversity very often source of conflict, real or symbolic, that it somehow is being handled in a different manner by trading with each other and sharing sovereignty. The problem is, of course, that today, most of the conflicts we have in Europe are generated by the EU, which we cannot ignore. But, look, this helps me also to answer one of your questions. What I know is, from people studying management outside EU, just management as such, is that the greater diversity, on the ground, the more pluralistic form of government you need to adopt to handle this diversity. But the EU has done the opposite. With each treaty, they try to centralize the government to govern ever larger group of countries. So in my view, this governance just doesn't make sense, because it simply is at odds with the ever-growing diversity. Why? The Union, at the beginning, it was called at the time European Community, 6 members. Now it has 28 members, right? Plus number of countries which are somehow linked to it by various treaties. Norway is in Schengen. Britain is not in Schengen, although it is a member of the EU. Just to give you an example of complexities here. Many other countries adopt European laws and regulations who don't even have a chance to become members. Ukraine is a very good example. They just, this agreement with Ukraine is that they adopt all European laws with no prospects to be a member. No promise even. And even promises in the European politics do not mean much. Ask the Turks. They've got a promise in 1963. So I'm not so excited by divergence. Divergence is a normal part of life. Only if you believe in exactly in this kind of Westphalian model that we have territorial state in which the government is in charge of all kind of functional fields, or if you wish, all kind of borders, economic, administrative, military, and cultural. And you have this container, which is nation state. Then, of course, those problems of diversity are problematic because they led exactly to the history we know from this Westphalian syndrome of war and conflict. If you open this, if you allow that there are those multi-level arrangements where the legal authority doesn't correspond with military one, and economic and cultural, like in the Middle Ages, this doesn't mean that there is end of conflict and war, because these arrangements are not to eliminate human nature, so to speak. But this changes the rule of the game, so to speak. And this is why I say we are back to this period of Middle Ages a bit, because of the simple reasons that this unbounding process has made a lot of leaks in these containers, if not destroyed them altogether, these nation-state containers. And European integration as such contributed to this too. About migrations, do you want to talk about migrations? One thing I know is that the Mediterranean Sea has become a cemetery. And this is partly responsibility of national politicians and partly of European ones. And as migration, as always with migrations, which is hot potatoes, there is blame game and no solution to face the problem. But this is a story about which we could have not just another meeting, but another session of meetings. And you know in Australia very well how difficult it is.
Jan, in your book, you come out ultimately more optimistic than you sounded tonight, because while you emphasize, as you did tonight, that the EU is doomed, you say strongly that Europe is not doomed. And part of the reason for that are the things, the developments you sketched in your last answer, these new conglomerations, arrangements, etc. But they can be seen two ways, either, as you've presented them tonight, as the source of dissolution of the state-based system, or they might be the new basis of strength, but of rearrangement and so on. As you presented it tonight, they come out much more strongly as the sources of dissolution. But if you think it's not doomed, how do you imagine a future in which institutional arrangements come to reflect these new developments and these new regional and functional and other clusters? Because I don't want the people in the audience to go away too depressed, since it's ultimately a semi-happy story that the book tells.
No, indeed, this is the question of perceptions. Look, if you look at history of my short life, most of the things happen not because they have been kind of planned, but because there was one big bang after another. And politicians helplessly try to limit the damage. We don't know what will be tomorrow, the next big bang. So I don't exclude situations in which things may go wrong. But I indeed don't believe that it has to lead to the black history of Europe of conflict and war. I don't see the reason why people will start, the business people will stop trading with each other because there's no European Commission, or why the German soldiers will march on Strasbourg because they close European Parliament. But I also see very difficult solution to reform it within the current framework because of the nature of politics. And part of the story is, and here is related to Australia, is that if Europe would be only the problem, probably would be easier to fix. But we are faced with democracy problem, with the capitalist problem, with the cultural shift. We have a lot of difficulties to reinvent our society anew. This country is extremely prosperous, and yet it talks about the crisis too, right? I've noticed, I just said to John before, that I've noticed that now on SBS there is no Australian weather, but national weather forecasts. So the government nationalized the weather, but denationalized schools and hospitals and so on. So it's part of the story, it's an ideological story, right? But, of course, Europe problems are specific too. It's not like that we are only a part of the global picture. So there are some things we have done together and we'll continue doing together. But knowing those politicians, and I work with many of them in the European Commission. I used to work with Jacques Delors. I used to work when Prodi was president of the European Commission. And I know a lot of heads of national governments. And my feeling is they will try to do what politicians always do, muddle through. And I believe this is not enough this time. But it will gain them some time. And international institutions, don't collapse like empires with Big Bang. They have the line on their own, even if they are fake. Students of European integration know about institutions that was called Western European Union. It was supposed to deal with security of Europe. It existed for 5 decades, and it was all fake. They had European Parliamentary Assembly. They had a secretariat. A friend of mine, the Dutch, Van Ekkelen, was Secretary General of this union, traveling all over the world and talking, about European security. But each time there was a security problem, European gatekeepers of this WU were choosing other frameworks. So they never were used for anything, for 5 decades. Because the states decided to deal through United Nations, through OSCE, or coalitions of the willing. And here, the fear which I have is that it will be exactly like that with the EU. That it will be kind of a facade. Behind this facade, people will do things their own way, like I described you with the German colleagues were saying. They will do in the circles which they find appropriate, because the institutions will not serve them any purpose, because they will not solve their problems. And politicians need to solve problems from time to time, right? Or at least to look like they are solving problems. So this dysfunctional institution, this facade can go on for some time, but not forever. And we may be lucky if there is not this big bang. We may be lucky and we find a way to fix some of those things. And some of those things means not only EU institutions, but also the problems of citizen participation, political parties, private versus public in the economic sphere, and all these things I mentioned, right? And they may fix it, but may not have time. But what I know that during this period of suspended life, this, keeping on life support, the life will go on. There will be other actors which will not be able to wait for states to agree in Brussels on something. And here I see exactly those firms, those NGOs, those states as actors who have capacity and probably ability to take it to another level. And they already are doing many things. If you look at major cities, how they cooperate like medieval, Hanseatic League already, you see, but they have different agenda. They are not interested in war fighting. They are interested in policing the streets. They are not interested in national agenda. Majority of people in those cities are multinationals, are migrants. So their agenda is different. And if they become, and people's loyalty will shift to those institutions, private or public, which actually address their needs. If this government is not able to address your needs, they have to move to other actors. And this is how I think about those things. And this is how I see this, from these hybrid arrangements, emerging something different. And I'm not getting so negative about this, because all people, current EU sort of specialists, will say, this is the recipe of anarchy. What do you say? No. Pluralism, diversity are supposed to be Europe's greatest strengths. They are only liability if you believe in this hierarchical model of governance with a pyramid, with some kind of bureaucrat dictating to everybody what to do, starting with the shape of banana and other things. No, then there are diversity is liability. Pluralism, I always believe the pluralism is democracy's greatest treasure. So, but you have to find a way in which you go about it. And I'm not advocating that everybody does everything on their own. No. But there are different ways to cooperate. Incentives can work better than sanctions sometimes. Sometimes delegated power gives more control over things than centralizing powers. There are different ways of doing those things, and we have to find them out. And I try to change the discourse. Am I right? I don't know. But let's talk about this. But as John and you, Peter, also said, other discussion, when I say this kind of things, people immediately say you are anti-European. How can I be anti-European? Because I'm European, I don't want to sacrifice Europe on the altar of the project, which obviously doesn't work. And I wish them all luck to fix it. But if I see what they quarrel about, like this issue of how is President of European Commission elected today, and this is something what people couldn't care less. It doesn't solve the problem of jobs, doesn't solve the problem of air pollution, doesn't solve the problems of the neighborhoods where they feel insecure. Who cares? These are all toys for boys. And there's also sometimes a lady like Angela among them. Toys for boys. And people have enough of this. Sorry.
Could I just push this a little bit while other questions are coming, and we should finish quite soon, to ask you whether there is a contradiction. I want to ask you a double-barrel question. First, whether there is a contradiction in your overall argument that one of the symptoms of disintegration is the lack of trust and legitimacy in these institutions symbolized by the EU. The contradiction would be this. It's a long story, but putting it briefly, in the year 1500, in this region, the historians tell us there were about 500 major political units, types of units. There were free cities, there was a church that wanted to be universal, there were Hansa Catalonian trading schemes, there were emergent states, there were emergent empires that colonized the world. A kind of crazy collage. But the one source of legitimation for lives in this sprawling late medieval project was Christianity. Of course, it's not the whole story. Greatly weakened in the 21st century. And your thesis is that, in a way, the attempt to build centralized territorial states that happened so that by the year 1900, there are only 25 major units left. And in a way, the European integration process is an attempt to carry on this simplification. And your thesis is, this is unraveling. And I think you're right about this. But then the question is, how to win trust? And here's potentially the contradiction I want to put to you. The old model supposed a glue. Someone asked about a glue, Christianity. That's not on offer. Your answer is functional forms of legitimacy, a plurality of forms of legitimation. So if I think about the areas, the chains of power that work well and are popular in Europe, I think of UEFA, I think of Ryanair, I think of Eurorail, I think of European universities, I think of Airbus. These function well, they have a global impact, some of them, and they're popular. But what about the losers? What about the losers? Isn't the difference, here's the tension, that since 1500 came rights, citizenship, elections, parliamentary democracy, an ethic of equality. What becomes of this in this scenario that you're recommending? How possibly could consent and trust be rebuilt with these forms of functional legitimacy that enable some to do things, but leave the losers out of the equation? And the second part of the double-barreled question is, I mentioned Airbus, but what about Eurofighter? People here, I'm sure, want to ask you the crude question. What about war in Europe? Is it over? Is it finished? The Ukraine, as you mentioned, is a site of war at the moment. But what about the future of war in this region?
Look, integration is not a medicine for democracy, war, and human nastiness. Yeah? All these things will continue, have to be handled in different ways. Integration is a small part of the broader context. You have today a lot of disillusioned voters in Australia, and you have nothing to do with European integration. One of the problems of the EU was that they promised too much. They raised expectations that they will fix all these things. They claim, basically responsibility for all the successes. No, they made some contributions to peace and prosperity, but it's, peace was not only thanks to European integration, it was also thanks to Americans or maybe even Soviets who scared Europeans to death. And as you rightly pointed out, most of successful integrative projects have nothing to do with the European Commission. And also, if you look this in broader historical perspective, we have to be cautious because there is a lot of mythology here. I mean, Middle Ages is this period of dark ages of war and conflict and basic. But sorry, if you come from a Renaissance city like Florence, what kind of dark period in 500? It's the most successful. Economic, cultural, and political project you could imagine. Yes, there were wars at these times, but it's not true that war was the first and only means of solving problems. The greatest territorial acquisitions in this period took place because of marriages. The greatest slaughter of people took place in Europe and the nation states, who were supposed to be so efficient. Come on. So these are a little bit mythologies. Christianity? Are you sure that Christianity, it's easy for us to talk as, as the kind of normative glue. Ask those who were burned because they were judged as disbeliever. When they thrown that, to the boiling oil, they screamed, so they were guilty. Ask them. Have you ever been to Medieval Museum of Torture? Talking about the universal values of Christianity at the time? And how come that papacy was so embattled by all other leaders? Is it only because of pride and glory of empire and kings? No. Yes, of course, you need some bonds of solidarity. You need some kind of collective governance. Otherwise, you don't have integration. But there are various ways of doing that. And most of all, when I describe all those changes, those three revolutions, I don't think, even though you can say the Maastricht Treaty was of our own making, but even then, this is a kind of European versions of globalization. So yes, there are always people behind those revolutions, but it's not like this that there is a master plan and somebody basically arranged it to screw us. No. But we have to adjust to change. And some institutions, some systems adjust to change better than others. And my only argument here is this one is not adjusted to change sufficiently. That's it. But let's not expect these or any other visions of European integrations to solve the problem of war, of greed, and of hatred. Like, I don't expect from the Union to generate love or happiness. I expect from the Union to deal with some of the problems we are facing and at least not to make them worse. And there are a number of reasons, and in recent years they've made them worse rather than better, although I should repeat, and I here agree fully with you, they have made a lot of things better for Europeans for many decades. Although they always claim more successes they were true, but you cannot also write them out from this history of successes, of prosperity and peace in Europe, which was enlarged time and again to ever greater number of countries. This is not historical myth, this is reality. But how to keep it going? We have to do it different way. And indeed, in my book, I go into a lot of details proposing changes, but I thought this would be, I would come like somebody from another planet, because these are very specific, kind of sometimes even technical suggestions to address it. But as you know, I have here a nice musical metaphor to show that, instead of current cacophony, we can allow some polyphony in Europe. And this is maybe a language which more of us would sympathize or understand.
I was going to call for last questions, and I was going to ask Peter if he wanted to comment, but I think the note of polyphony is the legitimate end of tonight. I wanted to thank both Peter and Jan. I wanted to thank you all for coming and your questions. You heard tonight one of the great European scholars who, in a way, given his sensitivity to the great diversity and complexity of Europe, is a carrier of exactly its best qualities. intellectually sharp, passionate, a great eye for difference, a defender of difference, and a sense of humor, you have to say. Thank you very much, Jan, for speaking to us tonight.